the word move as an option during play got codified in role playing fairly recently in Apocalypse World.
Yes.
Yeah, and one of the interesting issues is watching readers struggle with that, because one of Vincent's moves is custom move, which is when you say something that actually doesn't seem to match any of the moves, and all the Master of Ceremonies does is just, pick the relevant attribute and ride with it and roll it as if it were a move. So, in other words, moves in Apocalypse World are not losing the empty set of somebody doing a thing that doesn't have a name in the rules. It's okay. The rules will handle that. Make a custom move, don't sweat it, go. So in other words, do whatever you want is still part of Apocalypse World play. It's fascinating to watch people, once they see the word move and see the lists, a lot of them forget that. And I've talked to people who refuse to believe that what I just said is true. They said, in Apocalypse World, they say, in Apocalypse World, you have to do your moves, right? And when it's time to play, you have to look up and down your moves and pick a move. And I'm kind of like, no, just make your character do whatever he wants. Either it fits a move according to the Master of Ceremonies, or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, it's still a move. You're good. So that's what I'm talking about. Do you have open the chance, the encouragement even, or the awareness of open whatnot in terms of character action? What if I do something, and I'm not talking about an illegal act like attack when it says I can't, actually kill someone. But on the other hand, we'll talk about that in a minute, because that's an interesting point. But I'm talking about just doing something else that upon reflection actually is kind of relevant to the fictional activity that's going on. It could be done, and it could have an effect on what's going on.
Right.
And so is there an openness to that so that the events of play can frighten the Pascal programmer, because the events of play are now off of the carefully mapped, multiply branching tree, and everything's still okay. Play does proceed. You still roll for your resolution and whatnot. Maybe you have to set up a little bit about what's the nature of this resolution, what's its consequences. Maybe you have to, to think a little bit about, what thorns are, the loser still gets a thorn. That's okay, right? Is it possible, for example, to get a thorn that's, I can't remember from reading it, or I don't know from reading it. Is it possible to get a thorn that previously was unnamed, like a new kind of thorn?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's good. That's already, do you see how you have a piece of this kind of openness that I've talked about already in there? So that's good. That means that the characters can be operating off of those thorns that we did not foresee as the game maker. And I'm talking about letting that open up to the nature of the conflicts when and if possible, so that or when necessary, so that the player isn't just tracking down the written forks.
Sure.
Right? And that's really a big difference. That's a huge thing, I think, for learning the medium, is that you don't have, it's not like you're just moving your pawn, on the board, and then you can move this way or that way if it branches. And so and I don't think it would do any violence to your game particularly.
I don't know either.
But I think it's important.
Yeah, no, you bring up this point is very important. So, the emergent quality of the medium is what makes it hum, and the resonance, and those moments when people, as we've talked about a lot, obviously, where people, it all occurs to everybody at once, like, oh yeah, this, and it wasn't anywhere, and that's when the medium is working and the experience is happening and you can hear the resonance. My issue, though, with this game is that the fundamental goal of this game is like baby's first RPG. I hand it to a group of people, I walk out of the room, and they do it. They make it go. Now, you can't guarantee that because interpersonal things, whatever. But insofar as it's reasonable to suggest You have a little box,
right.
shaky shape. For that reason, and we've kind of talked about this, Jan and I'm willing to have a version of the game that is a training wheels version. Like,
I completely get that.
Do this.
Right? I completely get that. And that's why I didn't say just throw it open to the winds at every act and do whatever. I didn't say anything about taking your moves out, right? I mean, keep the moves where the way they are, keep the constraints on moves the way they are, but I'm talking about what do you do with what seems to be a perfectly good move that happens not to be on the sheet.
Right. And
that's what I'm saying. Yeah.
I don't think you're attacking that either.
Yeah. Let me give you one analogy. You're familiar with the game Snakes and Ladders?
Yes.
Often considered the baby steps board game.
Right.
Kids hate it. It doesn't actually teach board game play.
Right.
Because there's no winning. It's so deterministic that two chimps could do it all the way through and have no idea they were playing a game.
Sure.
And then the outcome would occur. And so there's no strategy, there's no assessment of current status that you can do anything about. You can't push harder, you can't relax, you can't think about maybe trying it this way. There's nothing in there that's actually strategic.
Right.
And so therefore it doesn't actually they claim it's baby steps for a board game, but it actually does nothing to turn you on about what board games do. And so there's a difference between baby steps and baby food, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I'm trying to maintain or another analogy is what I fought with fellow biology professors for decades, which they said, well, we're going to teach them this kind of catechistic biology with a lot of familiar phrases and a lot of, kind of standard ways of saying things, and that in many cases aren't particularly true. Metabolism does not reverse entropy, ever. It just doesn't happen. For example, another one, species adapt in order to survive. A species lasts longer than it would because it adapted. This has been shown to be grossly untrue. And many others. And certain phrases, too, that are just familiar, like breakdown.
Sure.
All students learn the word breakdown, and they know biologists kind of like it, so they just repeat it. But if you actually ask them what digestion means to use it without saying the word breakdown, they stare at you in horror because they have no idea what it really is. So anyway,
I experienced the same thing teaching theology.
Yeah. And so therefore, when I told teachers, it is not good enough to say that these are baby steps and then we'll do it right later. If they pass this, then they'll get into advanced classes and then they'll learn ifs and buts and, oh, that was wrong. They just told you that. I've had that, you may or may not appreciate this, but I've had this criticized as the Roman Catholic approach to teaching science, right? First you get your catechism and then you get your, then you get this and that. And you don't actually learn any actual Catholic theology until you're in priest training.
Right. I read that critique myself.
Yeah. Well, so anyway, the point is that particular progression, if that's the right word, some people like me call it lying. And so that's what I'm trying to avoid here is something that is so, like Snakes and Ladders has all the features of the form, right? You play your character, you make up what the character says, has the features of the form, but you don't actually do the fundamentals of the medium, which is actually to say what you want.
These are good notes. The game right now has two problems which are in line with what you're talking about, and I'm sure. One is that we recognized this last night. It has no bangs, to use the sorcerer term.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, there are all these situations where people get into the scene and they really want the thing and they role play for it and they get their bonus dice, but like the painful moment of making a decision that to me is like so emblematic, really present in the game. And that's related to the things you're talking about. We want more of that, obviously. But on the other hand, on the other side of it, it's like the biggest problem with handing this to people, to non-role players and to role players more so.
Yeah, sometimes I agree.
That's another conversation. But especially when I hand it to non-gamers, they'll say, okay, so what can I do? And getting their head wrapped around how to even begin taking the first baby step in the imagined space has been so difficult that I've erred a little bit putting all these training wheels things in. And I think for reasons that are obvious, absolutely like no GM for this kind of a game.
No, I get that. Yeah.
Yeah, and so the solution then is kind of you may have recognized my Polaris influence here.
Oh well, more than a little, yes. No, I get that.
So that structure I think is very powerful.
No, I agree. It seemed reasonable.
Yeah, and so the problem right now is that I'll say this and then you tell me how you think it relates, which is the muses now are a very powerful role that do very little in the game as such.
You mean mechanically speaking?
Mechanically speaking, right?
That's a good thing, though, right? They enrich the whole idea of everything that's going on, and that's a big deal.
It is a big deal, but in play, it's not really working out.
Well, the interesting thing, I think, is that there's a connection. Just as you say, there is a connection. Things that we have noted, all of us, in viewing role-playing as we do it, as we see others do it, that things that are thrown in as minor description, either of situations or of outcomes, either just enrich the imagination at the moment, or, and more often than we think, become raw material for next things. Right? You might say, the goblin's helmet rolls off. He hits the floor, and you just feel artistic for a second. You say, and his helmet, the goblin's corpse hits the floor, and the helmet just rolls away from his head. Right? You just felt like saying it. It's a cool thing, right? That was such a hell of an axe blow that just the whole thunk roll, strikes you. That could just be narration of its own. Until in a moment, one of the other players suddenly says, I pick up the helmet and I huck it at the guy.
Right.
Right.
And that's the beauty of the whole thing. Exactly.
So what I'm trying to say is that since that's not planned, and since it is it's very opportunistic, that's such an interesting word. In a strategic game, opportunistic means to take opportunity, right? To seize the advantage. Here, it's opportunistic in creative terms.
Yes.
It's it may be tactical as well. You can say, wow, I can get a distraction on that guy by throwing this helmet at him. All my spells don't do crap against this guy, but if I beat him with the helmet, it's going to give my friend a chance, right? And so I'm not saying there's no tactics, but it's definitely in the sense of it's what people talk about in terms of, quote, the reality. I hate the word, but you know what I mean. The fictional meat, that we're all working with here. And so if the muses' contributions can serve purposes of that kind, then you're really cooking with gas with the muses. Not that everything they say has to be picked up, but the point is that it's available to be picked up. And now, can you teach that is a good question. I think you can only teach it through doing. You cannot explain it. And you certainly can't tell the muses that this is their job. It's the listeners who have that job, who are going to take action. And so, therefore, it could, if anywhere, it's, seize upon anything the muses say as moves of as actions of your own. And hey, if seize upon what they say as a reinforcer of one of the moves you pick.
And that has happened a lot.
Right.
I've been really happy with that.
That matters a lot. That's really, in my opinion, where the muses matter, because the nature, especially, and I sound like a broken record, especially if one of those moments prompts the improvisation of a move, then you know that the activity of picking up on the fiction is active.
Yes.
And so, anyway, these are just some thoughts. I want to let you turn them over, and Jan can see the video, and we can, she can see what we think.
Sure.
But one of the most important things is nothing I'm saying, I think, is violating the notion of pick up and play. Remember my take, which is a little different than everyone else's, which is that instead of the things we're talking about being highly refined skills known only to role players, right? I'm talking about these as things that everybody has available to them, and that many role-playing games actually stomp on them as opposed to nurturing them.
Absolutely.
So with that in mind, we got to say, remember, we've got all of our human capability at our fingertips. The fact that you've got people sitting down to do this means you have the human capability at your fingertips. The only reason that it shouldn't work is if there isn't the inclination.
Yeah.
And that's fine. If there isn't the inclination, someone says, I'm just not inclined to do this. I'll sit through it, but whatever. That's cool. That's all you can do.
Sure.
But that should
that's
be the
not
only
a game design problem.